Will the prince defeat the monsters or become one of them? Monster by the Azrian portal. My mother once told me that monsters are not born, they are made. I used to take that very literally, believing that, somewhere, monsters were being sculpted like clay pots and thrown into the world to terrorize us all. As I grew older, I realized what she really meant. I watched from a cage as my brother strangled her to death. That made him a monster. I heard the yelps of my father as my sister cut him with shallow slices, ensuring his last moments was as painful as possible. That made her a monster, too. But one man's monster can be another's hero. Monsters are like beauties, they fit into the eye of the beholder. My brother and sister are monsters to me, but not to others. The slaying of my mother and father brought about a new order to our small corner of the world. Cultists, a group with a single burning desire to appease their own monsters of the underworld, took control of my brother and sister, and indeed every inch of land under the rule of my family. Our kingdom sat on a luscious peninsula on the western corner of the world. The joint that linked us to the mainland was narrow and set atop towering cliffs, as were most of our shores. An impregnable iron gate, set between thick stone walls, kept our kingdom out of the reaches of the wilder folk that lived in the lands outside our territory. For where we had water and life, the world stretching beyond was barren, an arid desert of sand and bone. Many had sought to take our kingdom, marauders, desperate and unhinged. All had failed to break the gates or climb the cliffs, but that's not how the cultists seized power. Their words, not weapons, won them their war. They poisoned the minds of my siblings. They came as traitors, allowed passage through the gates because they carried no weapons, nor spoke no ill but offered great knowledge and riches. Their disguise was perfect. Once inside, they sought to corrupt all 3 children, but not all could be taken in. I quickly grew suspicious of their fixation on death, rituals and monsters, and I was cast aside for it. My younger siblings were not so apprehensive. I warned my parents, but they dismissed it as a phase, exploration of the mind and spirit, my father said. They'd become so used to the threat of the sword, so conditioned to the stupidity of the marauders of the desert, they'd lost sight of how wars are truly won and lost. Over the course of 2 years, my siblings' minds were turned. Slowly, subtly and very carefully. I knew why, of course. As the eldest, I was adopted as the people's royal. I was involved in everything that went on in our peninsula. While my parents governed, I was the face of the family. My younger siblings were not needed, and they found it hard to find their own place in our world. Pushed aside by the family, and ignored by the people, they had very little worth in themselves. Then, somebody offered them something meaningful, and they took it. I don't see them often anymore. I'm not sure what role they play in the cult, but when I do, they use the word spared a lot. I don't feel it's a word that summarizes their choice in keeping me alive. Imprisoned would be something of an accurate description, captured, perhaps. They keep me on the furthest northern shore, with most of the other tributes. Our numbers grow day by day, the cultists allowing those who once attempted to attack our kingdom, the marauders, passage and sanctuary, in return for service to their unholy activities. Their existence within our world has made it a very different place. Before the cultists took power, our peninsula was populated by a few thousand people. Mainly farmers or fishermen, civilized and peaceful. Now, as the dregs of the desert have bled inside the walls, it has become a very different place. A culture of barbarism followed them. Brutish and violent. They drink, they fight, they murder in the street. When people like that meet with the civilized inhabitants, the barbarians win. For a time, the streets were mayhem. Our peaceful little villages transformed, from well-kept thatched homes with beautiful flowers adorning the windows to places of ruin. Families were kicked out of their homes, which were then ransacked and torn apart. Tents sprung up across villages and its outskirts. Before long, my particular settlement looked more like a war camp than the picturesque little fishing village it used to be. Most villagers had fled further inland, to some of the quieter areas of the peninsula, though none were truly safe now the gates were firmly open. But I couldn't leave. I lived in a cage, the same cage I'd spent most my days inside since the cultists overthrew my family. I was here, along with those residents who'd also been forced to these shores, most of which were loyalists to my family, given the choice of death or tribulation, for one purpose: to slay monsters. These were not monsters like my siblings, these were monsters of the sea. The cultists worshipped a few gods, but the greatest of them all was a giant with an unpronounceable name. The fanatics believed that, if fed the most monstrous creatures of all, the giant would step down from above and walk in the realm of the living. Fish wouldn't feed him, nor would corn or even cow, it would take true monsters. What would feed him were terrifying beasts few had ever laid eyes on. The task before them was simple: hunt the monsters and bring them back to be laid before the god as a feast worthy of deities. If they failed to feed their god, his wrath would be terrible, so they said. He would destroy the heavens above, leaving nothing in the afterlife but darkness. This was how they justified their mission, or rather, their control. Thus, the monsters sought monsters to awaken a monster. Well, that wasn't strictly true. They never sought the monsters themselves. I woke to a hot streak of blood lashing my cheek. Above me, two men stood, in the midst of a fight. One held a makeshift dagger in his hand, its blade glistening with blood, while the other clutched his wounded arm. The two were circling, waiting for the other to make a move, kicking up dust from the dirt floor at each other, before feigning lunges and springing back into place. Gripping the cold metal cage bars on which I leant, I heaved myself upright and strode right between the two men. They were both bald and slim, like every man kept in these cages. Skin and bone, but with broad shoulders. I eyed each one of them in turn, shaking my head. My narrow gaze and stoic expression was all they needed. Both backed off each other, nodded in my direction, and then in each other's, before retreating to different corners of the cage. "Drop it," I said quietly, but a firm inflection. The man wielding his makeshift blade opened his palm and let it fall to the floor. Too late was my intervention though. The overseer had arrived, rattling the cage. "What are you rats doing?" The overseers were from the lands beyond the wall, further even than the marauders. We didn't have many here, but they made their presence known. 7 feet tall, their faces were rounded and their bodies effortlessly muscular. They had a brutal look about them, dangerous. This one had wild yellow eyes, which flickered around the cage to all 8 occupants. He let out a snarl from his curled lips, the corners of which had 2 very small tusks poking out from beneath tough and dry mounds of skin. Carefully, he unlocked the door to the cage, bent down and entered, a large cleaver in hand. The overseers were a weird sort of person, thought to have been mixed with another species somewhere in their ancestry, although nobody was quite sure what. This one alone could easily take us all on without his weapon. He glowered around the cage, catching sight of the wounded man. "Fightin's for dogs," he roared, smashing a fist twice the size of a normal man's against the rusty bars. He spotted the makeshift blade on the ground, before casting another, even angrier look around. His eyes came to rest on me, and the blood on my cheek. "Does the princess need lessons in making friends?" he said, in a sharp, vicious tone. I watched as he leant over to pick up and examine the blade, and soon I found him towering over me. I saw the attacker, the man who had whittled the makeshift knife and slashed our cellmate, rise to claim responsibility.